December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor, territory of Hawaii. The sun had barely cleared the Kula Range when the first wave struck. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida circled his Nakajima B-5N above the carnage, smoke rising in black columns from Battleship Row, and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Below him, the Arizona burned. The Oklahoma had capsized. 8 battleships lay crippled or destroyed. Around him, his pilots banked and dove with precision born of months of training, their strikes methodical, devastating, nearly perfect. From the cockpit, Fuchida could see American sailors scrambling across oil-slicked water, their ships reduced to twisted steel monuments. The scent of burning oil mixed with cordite hung thick in the tropical air. In that moment, watching the Pacific Fleet hemorrhage into the harbor, the outcome seemed foregone. Japan had struck the first blow. America would negotiate withdrawal, concede Japan's sphere of influence in Asia. That was the calculation. That was the plan. Fuchida transmitted his famous signal, Tora, 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 Tiger, 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 the code confirming complete surprise. As his aircraft turned north toward the carrier Akagi, he looked back one final time at the destruction. What he could not see from that altitude, what no Japanese commander fully grasped in that hour of triumph, was that they had awakened something far more dangerous than battleships. They had awakened an industrial colossus that would soon rewrite the mathematics of naval warfare itself. The Japanese had studied American industrial capacity. They had read the reports, analyzed the statistics, reviewed the intelligence assessments. But numbers on paper carried no weight, inspired no fear. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, had warned the imperial staff of America's productive power. He had lived in the United States, seen Detroit's assembly lines, witnessed the casual abundance of American manufacturing. His warnings went unheeded. Most Japanese commanders viewed American industry through a lens of contempt, soft, undisciplined, concerned more with consumer luxuries than instruments of war. They saw a nation of individualists incapable of the collective sacrifice required for total war. They saw assembly lines producing automobiles and refrigerators, not warships. They saw a people accustomed to comfort, not hardship. They were catastrophically wrong. In the weeks following Pearl Harbor, American industry underwent a transformation so rapid, so comprehensive, that it would have seemed impossible to those who witnessed it. Factories that had produced automobiles began producing tanks. Plants that manufactured washing machines retooled for artillery shells. The entire productive capacity of a continental nation pivoted toward a single purpose: victory. But nowhere was this transformation more dramatic, more symbolic of American industrial might, than in the shipyards that began constructing aircraft carriers at a pace the Japanese High Command considered physically impossible. The Japanese Naval General Staff had anticipated losses. War is attrition. They expected America to build replacements for the ships damaged at Pearl Harbor. Their own projections suggested the Americans might launch 1, perhaps 2 large carriers per year if they mobilized fully. Japan's own construction timeline for the Teiho, one of their most advanced carriers, required nearly 3 years from keel laying to commissioning. The Shinano, converted from a Yamato-class battleship hull, would consume 4 years of construction time. These were the realities of naval architecture: massive vessels requiring precision engineering, specialized materials, and thousands of skilled workers coordinating complex tasks over extended periods. The Japanese calculations were built on their own experience, their own industrial capacity, their own understanding of what was achievable in warship construction. They had not accounted for Henry Kaiser. Henry J. Kaiser was not a shipbuilder. He had never designed a vessel, never studied naval architecture, never apprenticed in maritime construction. He was a dam builder, a roads contractor, a man whose expertise lay in large-scale civil engineering projects completed ahead of schedule and under budget. He had built the Hoover Dam, constructed highways across the American West, and pioneered techniques in mass construction that revolutionized infrastructure development. When the war began, the U.S. Maritime Commission needed ships, desperately, urgently, in quantities that traditional shipyards could not possibly supply. They needed someone who understood not craftsmanship, but mass production. They needed someone who could think beyond conventional limitations. They found Kaiser. Kaiser looked at shipbuilding the way Ford had looked at automobiles, not as a craft, but as an assembly process. Traditional shipyards built vessels from the keel up, each ship a unique project requiring skilled artisans working in sequence. Kaiser proposed something radically different. Prefabrication, modular construction, assembly line methodology applied to vessels displacing thousands of tons. His engineers broke down ship construction into subassemblies that could be manufactured simultaneously in different locations, then welded together in massive sections at the shipyard. Welding replaced riveting, saving thousands of man-hours per vessel. Workers were trained in single specialized tasks rather than broad shipwright skills, allowing rapid workforce expansion. The traditional maritime establishment dismissed Kaiser's methods as crude, unsophisticated, likely to produce vessels that would break apart in heavy seas. They pointed to centuries of shipbuilding tradition, to the careful craftsmanship required for vessels meant to survive storms and combat. They warned that speed and mass production would result in poor quality, structural failures, catastrophic losses. Kaiser proved them wrong in the most public way imaginable. On November 12, 1942, less than a year after Pearl Harbor, the Liberty ship Robert E. Peary was assembled, launched, and fitted out at Kaiser's Richmond Shipyard No. 2 in California in 4 days, 15 hours and 26 minutes from the moment the first keel plate was laid. 4 days. The vessel was 7,000 tons, 441 feet long, capable of carrying 10,000 tons of cargo. It was seaworthy, functional, and combat-ready. The speed of construction shattered every assumption about industrial capability. But Liberty ships, while remarkable, were cargo vessels, relatively simple designs optimized for mass production. The true test of Kaiser's methods, the demonstration that would fundamentally alter Japanese strategic calculations, came with aircraft carriers. In 1942, the U.S. Navy faced a desperate shortage of carriers. The Lexington had been sunk at Coral Sea. The Yorktown went down at Midway. The Wasp and Hornet fell in the brutal Solomon Islands campaign. America was trading carriers with Japan at a rate that favored neither side, and the fleet carriers under construction in traditional Navy yards would not be ready for years. The Navy needed carriers immediately, not fleet carriers with their 18-month to 3-year construction timelines, but smaller, simpler escort carriers that could provide air cover for convoys, support amphibious landings, and hunt submarines. They needed them in quantities that seemed absurd. Kaiser proposed building 50 escort carriers in 18 months. The plan was met with skepticism bordering on derision. Escort carriers called jeep carriers, or less charitably, Kaiser coffins by some Navy personnel, were smaller than fleet carriers, displacing around 10,000 tons compared to the 25,000 tons of a Yorktown-class vessel. But they were still complex warships requiring flight decks, aircraft elevators, hangar bays, catapults, arresting gear, aviation fuel systems, ammunition magazines, radar installations, and all the machinery necessary for propulsion and combat operations. Building one in a few months seemed optimistic. Building 50 seemed delusional. Kaiser's team at the Vancouver, Washington shipyard delivered the first escort carrier, USS Casablanca, in less than 6 months. Then they built another, and another, and another. June 1943, Casablanca-class assembly line, Vancouver Shipyard, Washington. The shipyard operated 24 hours a day, 3 shifts rotating through a facility that had grown from empty land to one of the largest industrial complexes on the Pacific coast in less than 2 years. Floodlights turned night into artificial day. The sound of welding torches hissed and crackled across acres of steel. Cranes hoisted prefabricated sections, entire bow assemblies, stern units, flight deck segments, into position with choreographed precision. Workers moved in coordinated teams, each person responsible for specific tasks repeated across multiple vessels simultaneously. Efficiency experts with stopwatches studied every movement, every procedure, seeking seconds that could be shaved from the construction timeline. The yard employed over 37,000 workers, many of them women taking industrial jobs for the first time, others drawn from farms and small towns across the Pacific Northwest. They learned to weld, to rivet, to read technical blueprints, to operate massive cranes and cutting equipment. They worked in rain and fog, through the gray winter months when the Columbia River ran cold and the wind cut through inadequate canvas windbreaks. They understood the urgency. Every week of delay meant sailors dying in the Pacific, convoys sunk by submarines, landing forces stranded without air support. At the peak of production, Kaiser's Vancouver yard was launching one Casablanca-class escort carrier every week. Every single week. The carrier slid down the ways with mechanical regularity. USS Liscum Bay on April 19, USS Coral Sea on April 27, USS Corregidor on May 12, USS Mission Bay on May 26. The schedule was relentless, the pace unprecedented. Each carrier left the yard fully equipped, ready for trials, ready for combat. 50 escort carriers were completed between April 1943 and July 1944, averaging one every 8 days across the entire production run. The mathematical reality was staggering. In the time it took Japan to complete one fleet carrier, American yards were launching 40 escort carriers. The industrial output represented not merely quantitative superiority, but a fundamental reimagining of what naval construction could achieve. Japanese intelligence officers monitoring American naval production initially dismissed the reports as errors or propaganda. The numbers seemed impossible. When photographic reconnaissance confirmed the pace of construction, when carriers began appearing in combat operations across the Pacific with bewildering frequency, the Imperial Naval Staff was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. They had miscalculated American industrial capacity by an order of magnitude. Admiral Ugaki Madome, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, recorded his growing dismay in his diary as 1943 progressed. He noted the appearance of new carriers in battle reports, the proliferation of escort carriers protecting convoys his submarines could no longer reach, the steady accumulation of American naval power that defied every strategic projection Japan had made. In one entry, he wrote of the inexhaustible American capacity, a capacity that transformed every tactical victory into a strategic defeat, because the Americans simply built faster than Japan could destroy. The psychological impact on Japanese commanders was profound. War is partly mathematics, tonnage sunk versus tonnage built, aircraft lost versus aircraft produced, pilots killed versus pilots trained. The Japanese had entered the war with superior equipment, better trained pilots, more combat experience. They had assumed rough parity in production, believing their own industrial capacity adequate to sustain attrition against an opponent they viewed as less disciplined, less committed. The reality of American industrial output shattered that assumption. In 1943, the United States produced 27 escort carriers. Japan produced 2 carriers of all types. In 1944, the United States produced 33 escort carriers and 9 fleet carriers. Japan produced 3 carriers. The disparity was not merely numerical. It represented fundamentally different approaches to industrial warfare. Japan's carriers were individually superior vessels with longer range, heavier armor, and more sophisticated damage control systems. But superiority in individual vessels became irrelevant when facing overwhelming numerical advantage. The Casablanca-class carriers were not impressive warships by conventional standards. They were built on merchant ship hulls, lacked armor, possessed limited speed, and carried only 28 aircraft compared to the 70 to 90 aircraft of fleet carriers. Sailors joked grimly that their thin hulls would burst into flames if struck by a well-thrown rock. The nickname Kaiser coffins reflected genuine concern about survivability. Several escort carriers were indeed lost to submarine torpedoes and kamikaze attacks, their lack of armor proving fatal. But they were present. They provided air cover where no air cover had existed. They hunted submarines that would otherwise have decimated convoys. They supported amphibious operations across the Pacific, from the Gilberts to the Marianas to the Philippines. They trained replacement pilots for fleet carriers, served as aircraft transports, conducted anti-submarine patrols, and provided close air support for ground forces. They were functional, adequate, and numerous beyond Japan's capacity to counter. The escort carriers became symbols, floating manifestations of American industrial abundance. Japanese pilots returning from missions reported encounters with unknown American carriers, vessels not listed in intelligence briefings because they had been commissioned days earlier. The psychological effect was cumulative and corrosive. Every Japanese success, every carrier damaged, every convoy attacked, was offset by the knowledge that more American ships were already sliding down construction ways, that losses were temporary inconveniences in an industrial system that appeared infinite. Commander Fuchida, the same officer who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, was reassigned to staff duty in 1943 after being wounded. From his position in naval headquarters, he had access to intelligence summaries, production estimates, and strategic assessments. He watched the American order of battle expand relentlessly, new carriers appearing monthly, tonnage numbers climbing beyond anything Japanese industry could match. In post-war interviews, Fuchida admitted that by mid-1943, thoughtful Japanese officers understood the war was mathematically unwinnable. American production had not merely matched Japanese losses. It had exceeded them by ratios that made victory impossible regardless of tactical skill or operational success. The Kaiser shipyards represented more than manufacturing capacity. They embodied a different conception of industrial warfare, one that treated combat vessels as consumable resources to be produced in quantity rather than precision instruments to be carefully conserved. The Japanese Navy treasured its carriers, named them after sacred mountains and legendary dragons, treated them as precious assets whose loss required elaborate explanations and ceremonial acknowledgement. American carriers emerged from Kaiser's yards with prosaic names like Coral Sea and Mission Bay, functional designations for functional tools. When the USS Liscum Bay was sunk by a submarine torpedo off Makin Atoll in November 1943, with the loss of 644 men, it was a tragedy. But the strategic impact was negligible because 5 more Casablanca-class carriers were launched in the following 5 weeks. April 1944, Imperial Japanese Navy Headquarters, Tokyo. Staff officers gathered around tables covered with reconnaissance photographs and production estimates. The images showed American shipyards from California to Virginia, massive facilities where carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines emerged in assembly line precision. The photographs documented a reality that contradicted every assumption about American weakness, every belief in Japanese spiritual superiority, overcoming material disadvantage. One intelligence officer pointed to an annotated photograph of Kaiser's Vancouver yard. He had marked the positions of 6 escort carriers in various stages of completion, their hulls arranged in sequence like automobiles on a Ford assembly line. His finger traced the progression: keel laying, hull assembly, superstructure installation, flight deck fitting, outfitting, launch. The entire process visible in a single photograph, multiple vessels advancing through construction simultaneously. Another officer presented updated estimates of American aircraft carrier strength. As of April 1944, 15 fleet carriers, 65 escort carriers, with another 43 escort carriers and 7 fleet carriers under construction or fitting out. Japanese carrier strength: 4 fleet carriers, 4 light carriers, with 2 under construction. The numbers sat heavy in the conference room, undeniable mathematics of strategic defeat. The officers discussed options with the careful language of men presenting futile alternatives. They could concentrate forces, achieve local superiority, inflict disproportionate losses in carefully chosen engagements. They could develop new tactics. Kamikaze attacks would emerge from such desperation in the coming months. They could appeal to spiritual strength, to Yamato Damashia, the spirit of Japan that supposedly transcended material considerations. But in the privacy of that conference room, looking at photographs of American shipyards where carriers emerged weekly, the truth was inescapable. Japan had miscalculated catastrophically, and no amount of tactical brilliance or spiritual resolve could overcome industrial reality. The data tells the story with brutal clarity. In 1942, Japanese and American pilots were roughly evenly matched in terms of training quality, though Japanese pilots had the advantage of combat experience. By 1943, the average American pilot had 300 hours of flight training. The average Japanese pilot had 150. By 1944, the gap had widened further. American pilots still received 300 hours, while Japanese replacements were being rushed to the front with as little as 50 hours. The consequences were predictable. American kill ratios improved steadily throughout the war, reaching peaks of 20-1 or higher during battles like the Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese losses became unsustainable. Between 1942 and 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost approximately 18,000 aircraft in combat. The majority of these losses were attributable not to mechanical failure or lack of resources, but to pilot inexperience. Japan simply could not replace its veteran aviators fast enough, and the pilots it did produce lacked the training necessary to survive in an increasingly hostile sky. The leather flight jacket, that symbol of American abundance, appeared with increasing frequency in Japanese intelligence reports. Captured jackets were studied, marveled at, and ultimately resented as emblems of an enemy that could afford to equip its pilots with such luxury, while Japanese aviators made do with increasingly threadbare gear. But the jacket was more than a symbol of material wealth. It represented a philosophical divide. American democracy, for all its flaws, had produced a system that valued the individual pilot enough to invest 300 hours in his training. Japanese militarism, for all its talk of honor and duty, had created a system that treated pilots as expendable, rushing them into combat with inadequate preparation and expecting them to prevail through sheer willpower. The jacket, worn, patched, adorned with painted bombs and rising suns marking victories, became a testament to the idea that survival was not shameful, that living to fight another day was not cowardice, that a pilot who bilayed out over the Pacific and was rescued by a submarine crew was more valuable than one who chose to die in a feudal banzai charge. American pilots wore their jackets into combat, and they wore them home. They wore them through training exercises in the California sun and through carrier operations in the North Pacific cold. They wore them during debriefings where they recounted their kills and their losses, where they mourned wingmen who had not returned, where they learned from their mistakes and refined their tactics. The jacket became part of the ritual of American air combat, as much a tool as the Hellcat or the Corsair. And when the war ended, when the leather jackets came home to towns and cities across America, they carried with them the unspoken truth that 300 hours of training had made all the difference. By the final year of the war, the myth of Japanese air superiority had been comprehensively shattered. American pilots dominated the skies over the Pacific, flying missions that would have been suicidal in 1942 with near impunity in 1945. Japanese air defenses, once formidable, had been reduced to a shadow. The kamikaze attacks, which began in late 1944, were not a sign of strength but of desperation, a tacit admission that conventionally trained pilots could no longer compete. The young men who flew those one-way missions had received minimal training, often less than 30 hours. They were taught only how to take off and fly in formation. Landing was irrelevant. This was the ultimate endpoint of Japan's failure to invest in pilot training. A force reduced to using its aviators as guided missiles because it could not train them to fight effectively any other way. American pilots who encountered kamikazes reported a strange mix of emotions. There was respect for the courage it took to fly such a mission, but also a profound sense of waste. They were just kids, one Hellcat pilot wrote in his diary after shooting down a kamikaze over Okinawa. Half of them couldn't even fly straight. It was like shooting clay pigeons. I felt sick afterwards. The comparison between the kamikaze pilot, hastily trained and sent to die, and the American pilot, carefully trained and equipped to survive, could not have been starker. One system valued life and invested in its preservation. The other treated life as a resource to be expended. The transformation of American air power between Pearl Harbor and VJ Day remains one of the most remarkable achievements in military history. It was not a transformation born of superior courage or fighting spirit. Both sides possessed those qualities in abundance. It was a transformation born of institutional commitment, a decision to invest 300 hours in every pilot, to build aircraft that prioritize survivability as much as lethality, to develop tactics based on empirical analysis rather than tradition. The Japanese had begun the war with the world's best naval aviators. They ended it with a decimated air force, their skies controlled by an enemy they had dismissed as soft and undisciplined. There is a photograph, taken in September 1945, that captures the end of this story. An American Navy pilot stands on the deck of the USS Missouri, watching as Japanese officers sign the instrument of surrender. He wears his leather flight jacket, the leather cracked and weathered from 3 years of combat. On the back, painted in white, are 32 small Japanese flags, one for each enemy aircraft he shot down. His face is young, perhaps 23 or 24, but his eyes are older. He has seen things no young man should see. He has lost friends, watched them spiral into the Pacific in burning aircraft, pulled their bodies from the water when there was anything left to pull. But he is alive. He survived because someone decided in the dark days after Pearl Harbor that 300 hours of training was worth the investment, that a pilot's life was worth preserving, that winning the war mattered more than dying gloriously. The Japanese officers signing the surrender documents had made different calculations. They had believed that discipline and sacrifice would overcome material disadvantage. They had believed that the samurai spirit, properly cultivated, would prove invincible. They had been wrong, and their nation had paid a catastrophic price. As they affixed their signatures to the surrender documents, they did so under the shadow of American aircraft, Hellcats and Corsairs and B-29 superfortresses, flown by pilots who had been given every advantage, every hour of training, every piece of equipment necessary to win. The legacy of the 300-hour training program extends far beyond the Pacific War. It established principles that continue to define American military aviation. Invest in quality training. Prioritize pilot survival. Develop tactics based on data rather than dogma, and never underestimate the value of institutional support. Modern American fighter pilots still receive some of the most comprehensive training in the world, often exceeding 500 hours before they are considered combat ready. The lesson learned in the skies over the Pacific, that training matters, that it can be the difference between victory and defeat, between life and death, has never been forgotten. But there is a deeper truth embedded in this story, one that transcends tactics and training hours. It is a truth about systems, about the way societies organize themselves and the values they prioritize. Japanese militarism, for all its emphasis on honor and duty, had created a system that consumed its young men without giving them the tools they needed to succeed. American democracy, for all its chaos and inefficiency, had created a system that valued its citizens enough to invest in their survival. 300 hours of training was not just a military decision. It was a statement of values. It said, "Your life matters. Your skill matters. We will not send you into battle unprepared. We will not waste you." The leather flight jacket, that recurring symbol of American abundance and pragmatism, hangs today in museums across the United States. Visitors pause before these artifacts, studying the painted nose art and the faded squadron patches, marveling at the stories they represent. But the jacket is more than a relic. It is a reminder that freedom, at its core, is about choices. The choice to invest in life rather than death, in preparation rather than improvisation, in the long, hard work of training rather than the seductive simplicity of sacrifice. The pilots who wore those jackets understood this, perhaps better than anyone. They had been given 300 hours to learn not just how to fly, but how to survive. They had been taught that there was no shame in using every advantage, no dishonor in living to fight another day. They had been shown that the measure of a warrior was not how gloriously he died, but how effectively he fought. In the end, Japanese officers had underestimated more than American pilots. They had underestimated the power of a system that valued human life, that measured success not in Bushido ideals, but in missions completed and pilots returned. They had believed that materialism and individualism were weaknesses, that a nation built on comfort could never match the purity of the warrior's path. But the 300 hours proved them wrong. Those hours, accumulated in training fields across America, had forged a force that combined technical excellence with ideological commitment, not to death, but to victory and survival. It was a distinctly American approach to warfare, pragmatic and relentless, and it had carried the day.